You know, these little videos are turning into almost like the thoughts of Chairman Mao. I don't know if anyone's listening, and I don't know if anyone wants to hear anymore. But anyway, today with Talking Scuba, I'm going to be telling you about my very first Red Sea liveaboard and how exciting it was. And I'll be telling you all of the things that you can't find out when you search the internet. I booked my holiday through Scuba Travel, and I was impressed actually with their service. The price included the return flights from Gatwick with a 23 kilo suitcase allowance, which just about fitted all my kit. And on the way out, I was met at the TUI desk by a Scuba Travel agent, so it was well organised. The flight out took just over 5 hours. I was met at Hurghada Airport and taken by coach for the 20-minute or so drive to our boat, the Hurricane. Now, I didn't know that the Hurricane was going to catch fire in 3 weeks' time with the loss of 3 lives. So I'm simply going to tell you what happened to me and how I felt at the time that I took the trip. And this again was in May 2023. Also, if you watch any further than this, you will see here that I took a video from the Gazala Explorer in May 2024. And I've sort of combined the videos, but I will only be talking about my trip on the Hurricane. But saying that, I did take a picture from the Gazala Explorer boat in 24, just taking a pan around the harbour, and look what boat we happened to be next to, the Sea Story. And unfortunately, 5 months after taking this picture, the Sea Story sank. But I'll come back to sinking boats and boats catching fire a little bit later. But getting back to my first trip on the Hurricane, got to the boat about midnight. By the time we loaded our kit onto the boat, found our cabins, unpacked some stuff at the diving stations, they still gave us a briefing and fed, which was absolutely marvellous. But it was late, it was something like 2 o'clock by the time we actually got to bed. Now, I was travelling on my own, solo, but I didn't need to worry. My new cabin mate, who was also travelling solo, had a really odd sense of humour. We got on like a house on fire straight away, and we decided we'd buddy up for the diving as well. So we moved our kit next to each other on the dive deck. Next to us on the dive deck was another solo diver looking for a buddy, and he also had the most odd sense of humour. So we henceforth became the 3 amigos for our upcoming 20 dives, and we buddied up all the way through. After a relatively slow start, we left harbour about 9, give or take, and we were heading for our first dive just after lunch. It was a compulsory check dive, and it will be followed by a second dive at about 3 o'clock on a reef called the Panorama Reef, and then we're going to have a 12-hour overnight run down to the Elphinstone Reef, a bit further south, quite a long way south actually. So we started off there at Hurghada, and we were going to end up that day at Marsa Alam. That's where the 12-hour run was going to be overnight. Some lovely diving around there. And then we're going to make our way down to St John's, right in what they would call the Deep South. It's the Egyptian Deep South. It's down by the Sudan border, and it's as far south as Egypt goes. So that's why they call it the Deep South. The Red Sea goes a lot further south than that, of course. The check dive was very professional. We had a full debriefing before the dive. The guides and the crew were well practiced in helping get the divers kitted up. Boxes of lead weights appeared from nowhere, and 22 divers were made ready surprisingly quickly. Some wore nothing more than shorts and a rash vest, and others, like me, were in a 5mm semi-dry wetsuit, and there was everything in between. The ages seemed to range from sort of 16 to 80. Some were just holiday divers and only came on one liveaboard a year. so they were out of practice a bit. Others seemed to spend their lives travelling around the world diving. Great fun. Right, the first note 1. The time of the year here is mid-May. The water temperature was 25 degrees and my 5mm wetsuit, or semi-dry, was perfect. I didn't have a hood or gloves. One of my buddies had a light 3mm wetsuit, a full wetsuit, but more suited to surface water sports rather than scuba diving, and he got cold wearing that. Note number 2, I had pre-ordered a 15-litre cylinder, steel cylinder, and I was pleased I did, and I'll come on to that a little bit later as to why. And note 3, all DSMB deployments of course are mid-water. You won't be down at 150 metres launching your DSMB from the seabed. I must admit that I did have some reservations. This was a big adventure for me, but my buddies had over 500 logged dives each. I had only 50 at the time, but both of my buddies were happy to dive as a 3 with me in the middle. During our check dive, the 3 dive guides seemed to be everywhere at once, and when we got back on the boat, the weight box came out again, fin straps were replaced. I was actually quite surprised how many divers had forgotten to bring something, but the guys on the boat were really expert at what they did, and it wasn't long before everybody was ready for the subsequent dive that afternoon. I must say here that any fears for my safety and well-being were completely dispelled. The crew and the guides were a well-oiled machine. As one of the oldest divers on board, I wondered if I would actually manage 3 or sometimes 4 dives a day, so I appreciated all the help I got. There was always a crew member on hand to help kit up. My fins were passed to me. I had a guiding hand to help me down the steps to the Zodiac, and then after the dive there was a helping hand to climb back up the ladder in full kit, a quick blast onto the cold shower to rinse the kit off. The Red Sea is very salty, and then I was then de-kitted, undressed, my wetsuit was taken off, rinsed, hung up, and I was finally given a hot glass of Arabic tea after every dive. I could not have been happier, and I didn't have to miss 1 dive actually during the week because I was tired. Note number 4, if I did this trip again, I would travel a day earlier and stay in a hotel the night before. It took me a good couple of days just to get up to speed again after not getting to bed on that first night until 2 in the morning. It wiped me out. And note number 5, the overnight trip down to Elphinstone was bumpy. And it was windy. I was surprised at how rough the water was on the reef. Just listen to the commentary on this next bit of video. We're starting to head up now to our 3rd dive of the day. Last one today. And the wind has picked up. The boat's been kicking about. There's food plates flying everywhere. But look at the surf on the top of the reef over there. Swimming in that. The pre-dive briefings had always been very thorough, but this particular one was exceptional. From experience alone, the guides can tell and determine the speed and direction of the current. And on this particular dive, we were told to expect that a negative entry down to 15 metres would be needed to avoid the stronger current and the winds on the surface. And this would be followed by an immediate swim to the reef wall. One of the guides would go first and report back to the Zodiac on the direction and strength of the current. There was a show of hands to determine who would go on this dive, and I think 8 of us went. I got to admit that I looked at my 2 buddies for moral support here. They said, "Don't worry, Grandpa, we've got you covered." We just double and triple checked that our low pressure hoses were connected to the BCD. We tested the BCD on and off a dozen times before we flipped into the water, and my heart was really pounding, I tell you. So we're talking about a negative entry here, down to 15 metres rapidly in water that's 150 metres deep. So if anything goes wrong, you're going to be saying hello to Davy Jones rather rapidly. But surprise, surprise, it all went absolutely perfectly and to plan. And once we got in the water, of course, it turned into the most wonderful dive. The current took us towards the reef wall, picked us up and gave us the most magical drift dive for the next 40 minutes down the length of the wall. Absolutely incredible. I was starting to get into the swing of things at last, but it did take me the first half a dozen dives or so to relax, enjoy and appreciate where I was. My diving improved tremendously and my air consumption halved. I started to embrace and look forward to the different challenges that each dive presented, and it was one of those experiences I knew that I was hoping would never end. Now, I know the idea of this video is about things that I've discovered in general terms and not specific to this trip, but I must tell you that I did my first night dive a bit further south than you see here, and I went with just one buddy this time who was a photographer, and he just wanted to sit there with his head poked in a crevice photographing sort of creepy crawly things and other great things. We were only in 20 metres. We were on a beautiful sandy ledge surrounded by huge columns of coral growing out of the rock. It was quite dark, quite black, but deep blue. With my buddy fully engrossed in his photography with his little red light glowing dimly in the dark, I indicated to him that I was going to swim around the base of this huge column of coral and that I wouldn't be far away, and the boat was less than 50 metres above us anyway. But apart from the glow from the lights of the boat, it was completely dark and surreal down there. I spent a few minutes swimming around the base of the coral and simply stopped and sat on the seabed to look, that's all, just look. I had literally only settled down for a few moments when a young shark appeared not 20 metres away. And this little chap was not in a hurry. He completely ignored me and just got on with doing what sharks do. He was in no hurry to leave this particular area, and after a good 5 minutes or so, he decided to come over and investigate the coral column that I was sitting on. This video here isn't actually him, but it's almost identical, so it gives you an idea of what an immature shark looks like. Anyway, he swam above me, he swam around me, behind the column, and again back a dozen times. And I lost sight of him in the gloom quite often, but he kept reappearing, a little closer each time. I just sat there as still as I could and breathed as slow and shallow and gentle as I could so as not to disturb him. I had turned my torch off and I was just sitting there watching this little shark swimming around in front of me, no more than 3 metres away, when the red light of my buddy appeared behind me. He had actually come looking for me a little while back and had also noticed the shark, so we both just sat and watched. It was incredible. We were a little late returning back to the boat, but our reason was accepted by everybody, and we were retelling that story for some time over dinner. My buddy's version of the story was that I cleared off and left him, and when he came looking for me, he found me sitting on the ocean floor playing with a shark. Awesome. Only 7 divers did that night dive, and I think the ones that didn't wish they had. But getting back to the boat itself, the cabins were adequate and quite functional. The bathroom was as you'd expect. It served the purpose, and the bed was comfortable enough, and there was some storage underneath the bunk and a drawer by the side of the bed, but most of the kit was kept up on deck. The food was a real treat. It was beautifully cooked and plenty of it, with a nice choice. There were 3 full meals a day, breakfast, lunch and evening meal, plus in between meals with snacks served in between the dives and unlimited soft drinks, juices and coffee all day. The boat itself seemed to be in very good order, but I'm no sailor. But this particular boat seemed to be having a few issues. Don't forget, this is the Hurricane. Considering that it burst into flames some 3 weeks later, I think some of these points might be worth mentioning. The Hurricane had seemingly just had a complete refit, but the height of the dive deck had been raised, leaving the ladders barely touching the water. So for someone of my advanced age and lack of strength, I pretty much had to haul myself completely out of the water to get onto the ladder. So I really did have a hard time getting back on board. I had to rely on the swell, moving the boat up and down to get myself back on. I managed most of the time, but on a couple of occasions a few of the lads had to come scrabbling down the ladder to haul me back on. The Nitrox, on day 2 we had the announcement there will be no Nitrox at all for the remainder of the week. So this obviously meant that all the dive profiles had to be re-looked at, dive computers reset and NDLs revisited. I mean, 4 dives a day just on air wasn't a great idea. Less dangerous, but just as important, on the second night my 2 buddies had water dripping into their soup during our evening meal. The air conditioning units up on the deck were leaking through the ceiling via the ceiling lights. So that particular table became out of bounds. On a slightly more serious note, one of my buddies, who was sleeping solo in the cabin next to the engine, reported that during the night he had to abandon his bed and sleep on deck because his carpet was drenched in diesel fuel. You know, they got it sorted the next day, but it made everybody think. And I suppose it begs the question, would I go again? Well, for the diving, I most certainly would. After I'd returned home from the Hurricane, my wife read in the newspapers that it had caught fire only 3 weeks later, 3 weeks after my return. And it took quite a bit of assurance to convince her that it was an isolated incident. I booked the Gazala Explorer for the following year, 2024, and the trip was everything I could have hoped for. But just as I was about to book the same boat again for this year, 2025, the Sea Story sank with 3 fatalities. And from the Marine Investigation Unit, the accident unit from here in the UK, it seems over the past 5 years there have been 16 accidents involving liveaboards in the Red Sea. 3 liveaboards have been lost in the last 21 months, resulting in, as we know, quite a few deaths. And interestingly, they also reported that the dive boats involved were poorly constructed and substantially modified, which we knew. And in fact, they've been extended to such an extent that resulted in completely inadequate stability. The investigation unit also said that essential life-saving equipment was either defective, out of date, or missing. And the rapid spread of the fire is indicative of poor structural fire protection, and essential safety equipment wasn't there. Fire detection system didn't work, and the fire extinguishers were either missing or defective. So my wife hasn't said that I can't go again, but she has told me quite clearly that she wouldn't be able to sleep for the week if I was away on one of those liveaboards. So I have to ask, what would you guys do? Even when I went on the Explorer last year, I made sure I had an upper deck cabin just in case. I had a bunk closest to the door, so what does that say? So if there's anyone out there still listening, if you are heading off to the Red Sea on a liveaboard this year, you will probably have the most incredible diving of your life. It is truly awesome, and the chances of you being on a boat that suffers a catastrophic failure are slim, very slim. So I do wish you the most wonderful trip, I really do. On my part, however, most reluctantly, I won't be joining you this year. I haven't completely given up on the Red Sea, but I will probably go via a shore-based dive centre as opposed to a floating liveaboard. But for all you Red Sea fans, I hope you found this video useful. But before I leave you today, I've got a favour. If you've got any comments about the Red Sea, about liveaboards, about your experiences, I'm sure there are loads of guys that would love, and girls, would love to see the comments. If you want to keep up to date with what I'm putting up on YouTube, it'd be great if you hit the subscribe button. It'd be nice to know if anyone's listening. I must admit, making these videos is very, very addictive. But if you, like me, are still diving in the UK in these cold, choppy waters, well done, I am. But whatever you do, wherever you go, do keep safe, keep diving, and take care.